a very large number of countries, representing the majority of the world's population, are not imposing sanctions on Russia. And what I try and argue is that this is a very significant moment, that it's not that these countries want to defend the invasion, but they are showing it's a symptom of their anger about the mismanagement of globalization over the last 30 years, which has been Western-led.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining us today are Mr. David Miliband, former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. He's currently the President and the CEO of the International Rescue Committee. And my second guest for this special edition is former National Security Advisor, Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Gentlemen, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So I will start my conversation with Mr. Miliband. Mr. Miliband, let me ask you, you've been in Pakistan. You've been certainly following the news, actually listening to and watching some of the devastation that has been caused by the floods. How different is the catastrophe when you actually see it beforehand with your very own eyes, observe it as an observer? And so tell us a little about your own experience and suggest to us that the scale of devastation that you see, what do you think needs to be done in order to mitigate the level of catastrophe?
Mm-hmm. Well, the International Rescue Committee has worked in Pakistan since 1980, so it's a privilege to be here to meet some of our 1,500 staff members, to meet some of our clients, and to try and understand how this country has become a real avatar for the fact that the climate crisis is here today, and it compounds pre-existing structural problems. You know that this is a country that's challenged by real poverty that exists in significant parts of the country, real challenges in meeting its sustainable development goals. Obviously, it's a very difficult economic moment for the country as well, which is pushing some people who are on the edge into really the worst forms of destitution. And then the climate crisis, which often is described as a challenge for tomorrow's generations, is shown in Pakistan to be here. I had a chance to visit clients and staff in the north of the country, in Peshawar, and I saw across the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province the scars of last year's floods, and obviously that's not the part of the country that was most affected. I mean, I'm speaking to the Chief Minister of Sindh, and he's going to explain to me the continued devastation in the south, but even in the north, the scars are evident, and the fear of what comes next. And so when you're saying to me, what's the way to react or respond, my reaction is to say, let's get out of response mode, let's get into proactive planning mode. And some of what I've seen and heard here from government, from international agencies, is the beginnings of a new approach that tries to factor in climate emergency into the drive to tackle the pre-existing economic and social problems. And just to give you one very practical example, my organization spends a lot of time giving cash to families that are affected by climate disasters around the world. We've also learned that giving that cash in advance is actually double the value. And that's an important lesson that I think needs to be taken to a much larger scale.
So now coming back to COP27, where we've seen discussion about climate reparations and emphasis on the role of developed countries to help developing countries. Where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I stand full square behind the commitment that was made 31 years ago in the Rio conference, which was common but differentiated commitments. And the differentiation is that the richer countries have to give more. And I totally understand why countries like Pakistan are focused on loss and damage. And obviously the Geneva conference was in a way speaking to that demand. But I also want to reflect on the following point. If we only focus on loss and damage and neglect mitigation and adaptation to climate change, we're going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Remember, when I was Environment Secretary 15 years ago, mitigation was center stage and adaptation was really the poor cousin. We're now at a stage where we can't afford to neglect adaptation, but mitigation is not being done properly. Mitigation meaning preventing future climate change. We've got a double challenge today, mitigation and adaptation, and I would be very concerned if the loss and damage question displaced the focus on mitigation and adaptation. We need to do all three. There are three challenges, I think, and obviously that has to be led by the richer countries, but it's not only a matter for them. It's going to take a really concerted effort across the board.
It's interesting you actually speak about it. Pakistan is among those countries which hardly contributes about 0.8% when it comes to its contribution to the global carbon footprint. It is at the same time among the 10 worst climate vulnerable countries.
Yes.
And on the other hand, don't you think the world should be doing more towards, helping Pakistan and countries that are more climate vulnerable?
Yes. I mean, it's a syndrome that if you look at something called the Notre Dame Index of climate vulnerability, the majority of countries in the top 10 of vulnerability are also fragile and conflict-affected states that have contributed very little to the climate problem and are being neglected in the international response. So the short answer is yes, but we have to be able to do more than respond to short-term crisis. We have to adapt to a new world. That applies as much to the humanitarian movement. I lead an organization that is really central to the humanitarian response in about 30 or 40 countries around the world. But the humanitarian movement has done a bad job of working with the climate movement. There's not proper risk mapping together. There's not proper innovation about how you inform farmers, how you strengthen seeds, how you adapt to a climate change affected, a global heating world. And then the financing of the humanitarian response and the climate response is not yet properly integrated together. So I think there's a lot of work to do. You mentioned COP, the Conference of the Parties. That's a UN conference taking place in Abu Dhabi in November, December. They've got a real job to make up for lost time, or more particularly to help the whole world make up for lost time. Remember, this applies to countries as they think about their own social and economic future. As Pakistan thinks about its future, it shouldn't want to be dependent on coal-fired power stations. That's a real problem. It's got to be able to chart a development course that is low carbon. It's also got to be able to make up for the damage that's being caused by carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so your demand that the international system help, I think, is well-founded. Your demand that it helps more is also well-founded, but there's also domestic responsibility.
So, Dr. Moeed, now let me come to you. We see this trend sort of emerging when it comes to climate-related discourse, a divide between the developing and the developed world. In terms of developing some form of credible consensus. What do you think should be the way forward? And do you see some form of identical patterns on other policy-related issues? And if not, then do you think that climate vulnerable countries like Pakistan and others should actually strike some form of an alliance to drive the point home?
Thanks. So, look, I think I'm in broad agreement with what David has said. The issue is that countries like Pakistan, I think, are in a bit of an impossible position. We're talking mitigation. The world should talk mitigation. The world should talk new technologies as we are. But for Pakistan, it's here and now. And so the adaptation part of this becomes, I think, an existential issue, much more than for many other countries. The supposition, I think, in virtually all the conversations, and perhaps in how you put it too, David, is that there is domestic responsibility. There's no question about it, right? Both in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of planning and how we manage it. A lot of times, countries don't have the capacity to come up with that. And what I saw at the at the back end of the floods this time is that the world telling Pakistan, you have to prepare your plan. It has to be clearly articulated. Unless we have confidence in what you are planning to do or what you should have done, we don't see where we go with this. The problem is, I don't think countries like Pakistan have dealt with it in a way that they have the capacity to convince the world that they know exactly how they're going to move ahead. Then the conversation goes too far, I think, in the mitigation direction, not globally, but for countries like Pakistan. We want the mitigation conversation. We definitely want investment in new technologies. But if we don't adapt, I think much of this is going to be a very difficult one for us. The other part, the alliance bit, I think We are geopolitically in a world where too many alliances are being created and misunderstood and misperceived. I don't know if we want another lobbying group or alliance here. What I really do think is the conversation has to move slightly more into David's lane. I think the humanitarian aspect, the humane angle to this, even when these floods were happening, a lot of the conversation was about the dollar figure. A lot of the conversation was about how much of the country is underwater. I actually went to Sindh, last year. I think the UN Secretary General was right. One had never seen anything like this. Literally never seen anything like. I think it's just not humanly possible to imagine that. So countries like Pakistan are really, I think, doing the right thing by telling the world where we may be in a slightly unique position, and somebody's going to come and help. One other point on new technologies. Last 2 or 3 years, Pakistan talked a lot about green technology. In fact, we kind of came out, politically at least, as a country and said we're going to go to zero coal and moved in the other direction, actually delayed projects, only to realize that there wasn't enough there in the international commitment and conversation to be able to do that, right? The cost was it simply wasn't adding up, and so now we've had to go back and start talking about how to manage this. There, I think everybody has a responsibility to come in and help us move to a conversation, beyond a conversation, to greener energy. And I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, Mr. Miliband, it's interesting. Both of you gentlemen actually spoke about the point of this debate between mitigation and adaptation. And the world, and particularly the developed world, seems to be moving in that direction of developing more of a mitigation approach, a renewed focus on new technologies. But for countries like Pakistan, don't you think an adaptation-oriented approach is more suited? Do you agree with this approach?
Well, I think you need both. I mean, and there's a very important piece of work done by Nick Stern, who's a long-term friend of this part of the world. He's a professor at the London School of Economics. He led a high-level panel that reported last November. I think it was a G20 panel. And he made a point that's highly relevant to the Pakistani situation and to your question. He calculated the amount of mitigation that needs to be done, the spending on it, $4 to $5 trillion a year around the world. He worked on the adaptation front, some of it very micro, some of it more macro, to do with infrastructure, the rest of it. But he made a third point, which I think is very important and relevant in this country, and actually relevant to something I was talking about this morning at the UN, which is the investment in natural capital. Your ecosystem is dependent on the Indus Basin, and your management of the natural capital of the Indus Basin it sits in and of itself as a critical component to your own security, and, if you like, in some ways, as a contribution to global climate security. And I wouldn't want that third leg of the stool to get lost in the mitigation adaptation discussion. And so apologies for taking it to this level of detail, but I think it does speak to, if you like, a responsibility, but also an advantage that Pakistan has. And it was very encouraging to me to see the way in which the UN, government agencies were giving some priority to that sustenance of the natural capital, which I think is important as well.
Yeah. So speaking of Sindh itself, and my next question is sort of like related to it, we've had a lake as a consequence of these monsoon rain and the floods. A lake was formed of the size of UK itself. And at one of these discussions where Ms. Sherry Rahman actually raised this point, how do we get that water out of there? So my question is then, how should Pakistan be adopting both preventive and mitigation-driven approaches to deal with catastrophes of this scale?
Well, I'm not a science engineer, so the first thing is to recognize the serious talent that exists domestically in this country. I was hearing yesterday about, seed strengthening research is not a foreign concept for Pakistan. You have very significant technology agencies and scientific bureaus that can do this, but there's also international experience about flood management, about water management that is obviously relevant. that is a central responsibility of your authorities, both at national level and critically at state level, because it's a different situation in Sindh than it is in the north in KP. So the obvious point is to go on to a proactive footing, clear that there's a new normal here. What happened last summer was abnormal, unprecedented, but the fear is that it's going to be happening again and again in some form or another. And that's why I think it's so important for people like me to come to Pakistan, to listen, to understand what's happening, but also to be speaking internationally about the way in which Pakistan has shown the future in some ways that's going to exist in other places too.
Dr. Moeed, let me indulge you on this
Can I
point.
just say one thing?
Yeah.
Last year, David, we came up with a national security policy for Pakistan, which is the first ever that we produced. And
There's a certain person who was responsible for that. I can't quite remember whose name it was, but he was a bright young man. I can't remember quite who
Can't take credit for things that haven't delivered yet. No, but one of the things there, we specifically included climate as a national security issue. One of the topmost national security issues when it came to Pakistan, for obvious reasons, right? Not many people perhaps know that we have the largest sort of glacial ice, quantum of glacial ice in the world, apart from the polar region. So we have to deal with that. But you also have to understand, as anybody who's looking at this, it can't become Pakistan's number one priority because of everything else that's going on. So policy-wise, we do need a lot of support. We also need sometimes hand-holding. But I found a lot of times the conversation would become geopolitical too quickly. Rather than just focusing on the issue on the ground, once you take it to the geopolitical space, I think it becomes very difficult for a country like Pakistan to make the argument that we're really thinking climate.
Well, I think that's a very good point. There are two important points there. First of all, your national security strategy is of a piece with other countries that are recognizing that climate security is not a nice to have, it's not a luxury, it's mainstream. Yeah. And it's very sad to me that in the US, where at the moment I live and work, under the Trump administration, it was almost seen as soft to be talking about climate security, when in fact it's a very hard security issue. And I think that's a point that's well made. There's a second aspect of this, though, which speaks to the wider geopolitics. And there's something interesting going on in the climate mitigation space. Despite not just the rhetoric, but the actions that the US and China are individually taking that are ratcheting up global tension, one interesting feature of their competition at the moment is the way in which there's, if you like, outbidding for climate mitigation. I don't want to say race to the top, but there's something of a race to the top. You've got the Europeans with the Fit for 55, where the Russian invasion of Ukraine has reinforced a low-carbon plan that the European Union had developed in the years before the invasion. You've got the Chinese committing to internal and external actions. I mean, they've actually committed to end support for coal-fired power stations outside China, not inside China yet. So there's obviously been extraordinary technological investment in China in low carbon, notably in solar, but also in other areas. And then in the last year, America coming to this low carbon transition with an extraordinary wall of money. I mean, it's advertised as $365 billion, but anyone you talk to will say that over the next 10 years, it's going to be over $1 trillion of investment going into low carbon investment in the US, which is a very significant play that will have enormous global consequences. You also hear about India, you also hear about others. But the three main players, EU, China, the US, are, if you like, there's almost one of the silver linings of the technological competition is the low carbon competition. Now, for the rest of us, the management of the global public good of a secure climate is something that it almost doesn't matter how we get there, but unless there is a massive step change in the way in which we think about global emissions, we're all going to be in trouble within our own lifetimes, not just within our children or grandchildren's lifetimes.
Dr. Moeed, let me ask you on this note. The floods last year started somewhere in June, and they lasted up until September, October. Do you think Pakistan is ready to deal with God forbid, another catastrophe of that scale in such a short span of time?
Look, I mean, I
Because
think...
we're staring at June once again.
Well, I go back to David's point, right? What is abnormal today, unfortunately, may not be abnormal in 10 years. That's really what this is all about. So we know now, data, you can't debate this. The time interval between major national disasters in Pakistan is much shorter than it used to be. Flooding is one example, but others as well. This is going to keep happening. So let's for a second leave aside the global conversation. Let us assume there's nobody in the world to help. Ultimately, it's going to be Pakistan, it's Pakistani citizens, it's Pakistan's wherewithal that's going to come together and figure out how to deal with it. Now, in reality, I think we have to be somewhere in between, right? We have to put together something, and we have, on what we want to do, and then the world has to come and figure out how to help. The frustration, I think, is no developing country on its own perhaps has the blueprint, and the world that comes to help too often starts thinking of the politics along with climate. That was my frustration. Frankly, I'm not sort of generalizing it, but it is absolutely true that what is abnormal today will not be abnormal tomorrow. If we are not prepared, we're going to keep getting into this again and again. And it's all good to say that we need more support, but we also need to be as prepared as we can be. So I think both go hand in hand.
So, Mr. Miliband, now let me come back to you and ask you this question about a write-up that you have almost now contributed for Foreign Affairs piece, and it's titled as World Beyond Ukraine. Tell us more about what the basic premise is, and in it you actually do speak about this concept of hollow solidarity. Could you just enlighten us more on your recent contribution?
So the subtitle of the article in Foreign Affairs is almost as important as the title, and the subtitle is The Test of the West and the Demands of the Rest. And so it tries to speak to this phenomenon that while 140 countries in the United Nations General Assembly denounced the invasion of Ukraine, and there are very few countries that would defend the invasion of Ukraine, a very large number of countries, representing the majority of the world's population, are not imposing sanctions on Russia. And what I try and argue is that this is a very significant moment, that it's not that these countries want to defend the invasion, but they are showing it's a symptom of their anger about the mismanagement of globalization over the last 30 years, which has been Western-led. And in that sense, it speaks to the climate issue that we've been talking about, but it also speaks to sustainable development goals that are off track in a very significant way. The COVID pandemic, where the inequities in vaccine access became a poster child for inequity. And so I argue that there are three sets of demands from, if you like, the rest. One is about solidarity, and there my argument is that solidarity has been hollow up to now on too many issues, including the climate issue. Secondly, that there's a demand for voice in the international system, right up to the UN Security Council, where the current structure reflects the world as it was, but rather than the world as it is, but it's also reflected in other institutions, including, for example, in the management of the COVID pandemic. And thirdly, I make an argument that while there is a demand for defending democracy in the West, that's part of a bigger picture in which the real debate of the decade is between what I call impunity versus accountability. Impunity is the exercise of power without checks and balances, which in its most extreme form is crimes without punishment, including war crimes. And the opposite is accountability. And my argument is democracy is a form of accountability, but it's not the sum of accountability. And what I suggest in the piece is that for Western leaders, if they frame the global argument as one of impunity versus accountability, it's going to be a much more inclusive coalition than if it is democracy versus autocracy. And so those three pillars, one, the management of global public goods and solidarity and equity in doing so. Secondly, the voice in the international system. And third, the framing of the international debate need to come out of this war in Ukraine for the world beyond Ukraine. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of resonance that gets. I've got some specific measures, but that's the architecture of the argument.
So interesting. I haven't read the piece yet. Of course, it's just come out. If that is true, and I actually tend to agree with what you're arguing. One, it'd be interesting to see what kind of reception you get in the West for this. But I'll tell you my experience. And I think if what you're arguing is correct, which I think it is, the Ukraine war, the year plus of the Ukraine war, has now reinforced the view in much of the rest of the world of this inequity and sort of approach to crises and wars. Why? I personally saw a very interesting case study, essentially went through a case study, if you will, speaking academically, which was Pakistan's position on this war when it started. I mean, of course, the then Pakistani Prime Minister landed up in Moscow on the fateful day on a pre-planned visit, which had nothing to do with the conflict. But what I ultimately, working the channels I was in government at that time, realized was that the West could not understand Pakistan's position. No matter what you said in what language, there was just a barrier. And we were never arguing that we had anything, to do with suggesting that the war was something that was not aboard, or the action in Ukraine and the invasion, whatever. All of the conversation was the same. The problem was that I think in the Western mind, there was a completely different benchmark for the war in Ukraine because the West had been attacked, versus for anything else that would happen in the rest of the world. So, one of the arguments I remember making was that for me, Kashmir is as existential as Ukraine may be for Western Europe. Not an argument that was accepted, right? It was, no, this is now a global crisis because we are hurting. Kashmir will come to later. Something else will come to later. The point I'm making is, I walked away believing that there was actually a different, subconsciously, different standard for what happens in certain parts of the world versus in other parts of the world. And I've seen other leaders, developing country leaders, make this argument. In fact, I think Pakistan was saying exactly what others were saying, including the West. But that conversation could never happen because the sense was, unless you come out and vote every time for what I'm asking you to vote for, you must not be on the right side of this argument. So if what you're arguing is correct, I would suspect a year down the line, that part of the world that had a problem with the globalization of the 30 years is probably reinforced in its view.
Well, I rather make the argument that the war has united the West but divided it from the rest. So it's deepened the divisions, but I'm not a lone voice. I mean, I quote President Macron, who said at the Munich Security Conference that we, the West, had lost the trust of the rest. And so I think there is a recognition that if you look at some very basic indicators, the funding of UN appeals for Ukraine versus the funding of UN appeals in Ethiopia or Yemen or Afghanistan or even in Pakistan, you can see some inequity there. Equally, I think it's very, very important. We have International Rescue Committee teams in Ukraine. I mean, they're close to the front line. They're humanitarian. They're not involved in the fighting, obviously. But what we're seeing is a grotesque attacks on civilians in the country. I mean, it's part of the strategy that civilians get attacked by the invading force. And so that says that international law, which is meant to prescribe those attacks, is under very serious assault. Not the only place that this is happening. And my argument about impunity versus accountability is precisely that this is not an unusual occurrence. We see it in too many of the places where we do humanitarian work. The civilians and aid workers are in the front line, and actually the latest figures are that about 70% of the casualties in war are civilians, not soldiers, which is an extraordinary turn of events if you stop and think about it. So all of this goes to say we're at a moment of big change in the global geopolitical system. Some people think it's about blocks. There's a lot of work to be done about what this multipolar world is going to look like. But I think it's very striking. You mentioned the Pakistan national security strategy. The US national security strategy starts with 2 points. One, there's rising global risks. But secondly, we're in the post post-Cold War world. In other words, we're in a multipolar world. And the shape of that is still very much up for grabs. But my own fear is that it's trending to a world of impunity, not a world of accountability. And I think that's dangerous way beyond Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think there has to be, look, I mean, we really thought the world was past these kind of military conflicts, right? Big, major wars happening, nuclearized regions in the middle of Europe, didn't even happen in the Cold War. So how can you not abhor what you're saying, the civilian casualties and you know, the way this has been done? There's no question about that. Why is it that we are unable to look beyond, quote unquote, who's on which side and focus on how to end this particular suffering as soon as possible? Even there, I thought it was just such a difficult conversation because not the expectation, but at least the way it was internalized was the political positioning, i.e. the voting or other things, will determine which side you're on for us, right? And I think both sides did that. So my point here would be, frankly, that we really now need to think about, these are real human lives that are being lost. We are in the 21st century. We need to get beyond parochial politics and focus on this issue of essentially individuals, humans who are suffering.
Since we are definitely in a globalized world and a globally connected world, your organization IRC is certainly involved in humanitarian relief in Ukraine. Tell us some of the challenges that your organization has faced on the ground, and then at the same time also help enlighten us the kind of challenges your organization and other organizations have been facing towards providing humanitarian relief in equally important other places like Yemen, like Syria, Afghanistan, or
so
in fact
NGOs
different
always
countries
start
in
talking
Africa.
About money, so I'm not going to start talking about money. I'll come to that at the end. Number one, there are 54 civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment. That's many more than during the Cold War. 8 of them are at a high level of intensity as measured by battlefield deaths. So we've got a crisis of diplomacy when it comes to wars within states, which last longer than wars between states, actually, interestingly enough. Secondly, the virulence of conflict is striking and puts civilians and aid workers much more in the front line than ever before. Thirdly, civil conflicts are being internationalized. You mentioned Yemen. I mean, there's a wide range of international players, ditto in Libya, historically elsewhere. Now Yemen, we have a peace agreement, remarkably, which is a major step forward for 2023. So we're facing the internationalization of conflict. Fourthly, we're facing more and more activities of non-state actors. You can think of a lot of places nearby where that's been the case, but there's also the case in Somalia. It's also the case in northeast Nigeria. And so the onus on us to negotiate access, not just with state players, but with non-state players, because we have a commitment to reach those in need, whoever is in governance, is striking. And if you look at the International Committee of the Red Cross, they say that there's now 80 to 100 million more people under the control of non-state actors rather than state actors. So you've got significant challenge. Now, all those factors mean that reaching people has got harder, even before you get to the organizational challenges of being spread across 35 to 40 countries, and before you reach the financing issue, that there are 340 million people around the world in humanitarian need. 90% of them are in the 20 countries on the IRC emergency watch list. Any of your viewers and listeners can go to rescue.org and they can see our emergency watch list of the top 20 crises of 2023. And the financing's being stretched. Now, there's one other point that I think is important and where Pakistan is an interesting test case. We do micro-social and micro-economic interventions. We're sort of making the world better one life at a time, if you like. It's very micro. But the macro-politics and the macroeconomics are in danger of swamping the micro-social and the micro-economic interventions. And that's a question we're talking in the week of the World Bank meetings in Washington. There's massive onus to think about these global risks alongside the local risks that we're trying to take on.
Yeah, now speaking about another important country in the region, which you certainly might have dealt with in the past, and you certainly have, and this is Afghanistan. Right now we see Afghanistan, which is under Taliban, is actually reeling from an acute food insecurity. Where certainly a threat of providing humanitarian relief to people out there. Let me ask you, we have Taliban, which certainly is trampling upon certain human rights. And then at the same time, people are in need of critical humanitarian supplies. How do we then strike a balance in terms of, providing that important relief intervention versus, having a stand on human rights issues? And then in the backdrop of Ukraine conflict, the way it's been affected, it has sort of been pushed back to the back burner. What do you say about that?
Well, I can speak for the we of the International Rescue Committee, not the we of global players in any way. We, the IRC, we have a large presence in Afghanistan in 12 provinces. We're supporting about 8,000 staff in the country, so large effort in health, education, malnutrition. Food security is a very diplomatic way of referring to a malnutrition crisis, which is really caused by economic factors. There's a climate dimension, interestingly, but it's fundamentally a collapse of the war economy, and it's not being replaced by another economy. By the way, there's a malnutrition issue in Pakistan, which is shocking too. We're expecting new numbers that show literally millions of kids in a malnutrition situation. In Afghanistan, our approach has been very practical. We employ women as well as men. We have 3,500 women staff. We've been able to reopen in over 70% of our services with local agreements for exemptions and other commitments that have allowed us to run those services, because this is not an ideological point, it's a practical point that you need women staff at all levels, and not least you need women staff to reach other women clients, because under local norms it requires women to serve women. And obviously we're very concerned about the latest developments and about whether or not we're going to be able to continue our work, which, by the way, is not Western aid workers helicoptering in to help Afghans. This is about Afghan staff. We have absolutely minuscule number of international staff in the country. This is thousands and thousands of Afghan aid workers wanting to help their own fellow citizens, and we approach it in a very practical way, but we have to approach it in a principled way as well, and that's about helping people in need.
Dr. Moeed, let me indulge you over here. We've often seen this question of recognition, and there's a lot of friction between Taliban and the international community on this issue. Is there anything that can be done about this at this moment?
The short answer is no. There are a number of factors here.
And why?
Yeah, a number of factors here. Look, first of all, Ukraine has really taken attention away. You can sense it, you can feel it, the number of conversations. Afghanistan's kind of the forgotten theater. I don't think that's about to change, unfortunately, unless there is another major crisis coming out of Afghanistan, and I'll address that in a second. Second, I think the positions are simply dogmatically opposed, right? The West, it's impossible to see Western countries, and more importantly, Western populations, move away from the position on girls' education, human rights in general, right? And that's just, you can't, there is no way to object to that. There was a sense in the beginning, in fact, we tried that for a while, talking to the Taliban, that there would be moderation. This won't be the 90s. There will be different approaches to governance. On these particular issues, unfortunately, there seems to be no give as far as they're concerned, for various reasons that they've put out. So I don't think the positions, there is any way to actually change where both sides stand. If that's true, and the Afghan economy and the functioning of the economy is linked to Afghanistan opening up, I think we're in an impossible position. Now the problem here is, and that's where I really worry, that if you look at what's happening, and not who's right and who's wrong, we are repeating every single thing we did collectively, we meaning the world now, not IRC, in the 90s. Afghanistan is isolated, essentially. World Bank put out a number earlier that about 97% would be below the poverty line, give or take, somewhere there now. The micro interventions are keeping people alive, but there is no economic activity to speak of that shows positive prospects or healthier prospects for people, right? What's happening? IS has gained ground. There's definitely a presence there. We've seen terrorism in Afghanistan continue. Outward migration happened in big numbers, perhaps underreported, but I don't put another wave of outward migration beyond us, given where the situation is. Are we going to wait for another major spark in or out of Afghanistan before the world wakes up to the reality that we are really playing with fire here? I worry that we will not have the global focus on Afghanistan, but the situation will continue to be very, very bad in terms of the humanitarian aspect, but also I think geopolitically we're right at that edge. So that's why Pakistan's argument, again I think somewhat misunderstood, was constantly to tell the world we also don't like what's happening. In fact, I'll tell you, Pakistan hurts most because of some of the positions on girls' education and otherwise. Because then extreme elements even in Pakistan start looking at that and say, well, why can't we do that? We should also do that, right? Because that's the right way to go, etc. Thankfully, it's not even a fringe in Pakistan, but it does matter. We have these linkages going back to the 80s, it's porous water, all of that stuff. So we also want that, but we realize that if a conversation with Afghanistan dies globally, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We'll end up in a collapse kind of situation, migration, and perhaps more space to international terrorists, which is the history we've seen in that country if governance completely collapses. So to me, I think the world should be worried more. We should have a greater conversation. I know it's a very difficult conversation to have. Somehow we've got to separate enough economic activity to avoid collapse while pushing for the right answers on human rights.
Okay, gentlemen, I have a question for both of you. I'm going to be sounding slightly dramatic. Do you think we're headed towards a suicidal path, if we look at the world at large? Or do you see some prospects or opportunities that we can work together in terms of getting out of multiple crises that we have at our hands?
I mean, I don't think we're on a suicidal path. I think that there are dangers on the path, but it's not a suicidal path. And I think it's very important to recognize the world has more resources to do more good than at any time in human history. And there is enormous potential to shape our own future. There's been no decision to run towards conflict. And if you look at the title of Kevin Rudd's book, The Avoidable War, about China and the US, that's exactly the right way of putting it. More fool us, our generation and future generations, if we fritter away the resources that we have to tackle the problems that exist, the problems that we've created, the problems that we've inherited. And so I think that we have agency on this. There's no predestined disaster, but there's a lot of global challenge, some of which is being made worse by our politics rather than better.
Dr. Moeed?
I'll say two things. I think I wouldn't call it a suicidal path. I would call it a unnecessarily confrontational path. Unnecessary because I think there is enough to cooperate on. There is enough integration in the world. There is enough that everybody benefits from when you cooperate that we can avoid it. But, I was very recently in China. Of course, all my conversations with colleagues in the West as well. I do think that these quote-unquote camps are talking past each other. I do think a lot of times the policies may now be becoming a function of the perception of what the other wants to do or says, right? And there is one problem that I think is unique. In the Cold War, is very clearly ideological in that sense, and then sort of the geopolitics was built around that. In this case, you've got a deep integration of the economies, but a very different culture of diplomacy and communication. And I don't think both sides understand the meaning of what the other is saying or wants to do. And the actions are now, I think, far more competitive than they would be if they realize the damage I think that would be done if this confrontation keeps going where it's going. And also remember, there are many, many countries who are going to be the grass that's going to be trampled. So you could see a bloc emerge that continues to push and convince these bigger players not to go in that direction. I think it doesn't serve anybody. So I'm worried because we're moving in a direction too fast, which won't be good. But I don't think it's suicidal in that way. The communication part, I don't know how to work on. Maybe David's better placed. I don't know how to work on that, but the global communication is really struggling. I think it's as simple as a language issue in some cases. When I read some of the statements and I understand the American mind, and then I put myself in China's shoes, I don't think the confrontation is as sort of predetermined as it seems to be at this point.
So, gentlemen, both of you have worked in the government and have also equally given importance to issues like, climate change, human development, economic security. Then let me ask you, how different are these issues when you see it from a very different role that you presume, Mr. Miliband, and say now, Dr. Moeed, that now you've left the government? How closer are these issues to your heart? And then linking it to my previous question, are we certainly on the right track then?
If you're in government, you see the big picture, and the danger is you lose sight of the people. If you're running an NGO, you see the people, the danger is you lose sight of the big picture. And that's why in all my work I try and join the two. We're off track as a global community, so-called. You look at any indicators, it feels more like a runaway world than a managed world, and certainly more like an unequal world rather than an equal one. My organization tries to help some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and from their perspective, there's too much going wrong rather than going right, and that's why we try and use our voice as well as our operational capacity to achieve a tilt, to achieve a reboot, because there's a lot that needs to be rebooted.
Dr. Moeed?
Look, I think, to me, national security is nothing but security for your most deprived citizen. If you can't focus on the concept of comprehensive national security, which is oriented towards human beings, I think the rest is all irrelevant. So if you talk about, me working on particular lines when I was in government, we have economic security as the core of our national security. That's what's been espoused, right? But understand, people I think have missed the point that economic security is just a tool to get to human security. At the end of the day, that's what this is all about. Yes, too much of our time as a global community goes into the kinds of things we've talked about in terms of geopolitics and confrontations, but I think that's exactly the right path to take. And I think David is right. Sometimes you look at the big picture and then, human beings become the things that kind of fall by the wayside. That's what you got to remind yourself of as a policymaker. So I think Pakistan's on the right track on that. It's not going to be an overnight shift or achievement of goals. But SDGs, yes, we're committed to that. Every country needs to push. We are off track. I don't think we're going to make it. But the more we focus on that, the better your community and society and citizens are going to be. So I think that's exactly the right path to take.
Gentlemen, on this note, I must say we must conclude. And I must also confess, and although it's said in a very cliched manner, I certainly do stand educated, and I'm sure so do our audience. So on this note, I thank both of you for your special participation in InferTalks. Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Mr. David Miliband and Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you would like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.